The dust hung thick in the Colorado air as the lone figure approached Millbrook Valley on that scorching afternoon, 1876. From a distance, she looked like any other traveler worn down by the unforgiving frontier, but as she drew closer, something about her gait, her posture, the way she carried herself, sparked recognition in those who dared to look. The woman walking toward town was Sarah Mitchell, daughter of William Mitchell, who owned the general store on Main Street. She had been dead to this town for 10 long years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had been 15 when the Apache took her during a raid that left 3 families devastated and the entire community scarred. Most folks assumed she was dead within a week. Her father had searched for months, riding out with every patrol and trading party that would have him following cold trails that led nowhere. Eventually, even William Mitchell stopped looking. The general store that had once been the heart of Millbrook Valley became a hollow shell, its owner a broken man who served customers with dead eyes and trembling hands. Now she was back, but she wasn't alone. Walking beside her was a child, perhaps 4 years old, with Sarah's green eyes but darker skin and straight black hair that caught the sunlight. The sight of them together sent shockwaves through the small community faster than wildfire spreads through dry grass. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson was hanging laundry when she first spotted them from her kitchen window. She dropped the wet shirt she was holding and ran to find her husband. Old Pete Harrison was loading grain into his wagon when he caught sight of the pair and stood frozen, his mouth agape. By the time Sarah and the child reached the edge of town, a small crowd had gathered, their faces a mixture of disbelief, horror, and something else entirely. The whispers started immediately. Some said she had been corrupted by her time with the Apache, that she could never truly be one of them again. Others argued she was still William's daughter, still one of their own who deserved compassion after years of unimaginable hardship. The division was immediate and fierce. Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of Millbrook Valley feeling like a stranger in her own birthplace. The town had grown since she left, new buildings dotting the main street, but the mountains surrounding the valley remained exactly as she remembered them. Those peaks had been the last thing she saw as a 15-year-old girl being carried away. And now they witnessed her return as a 25-year-old woman who had lived through experiences most people couldn't imagine. The child beside her, Maria, clutched a small wooden doll that Sarah had carved during their journey. The little girl didn't understand why people were staring, why voices were raised in anger, or why some faces showed fear when they looked at her. Maria had been born into a world where survival mattered more than the color of your skin or the circumstances of your birth. She spoke both English and Apache fluently, could track animals through difficult terrain, and knew which plants could heal and which could kill. In many ways, she was more prepared for frontier life than most children born in town. Sarah had spent countless hours during their long walk preparing for this moment, but nothing could have readied her for the intensity of emotions that crashed over her as she recognized familiar faces aged by time and hardship. There was Dr. Marcus Webb, who had delivered her as a baby, now with completely gray hair and deep lines around his eyes. Behind him stood Mrs. Ruth Collins, who had taught her to read at the schoolhouse, her expression torn between joy and uncertainty. The crowd continued to grow as word spread through the town. Sarah could hear fragments of heated conversations, people debating her fate as if she weren't standing right there, listening to every word. Some voices carried genuine concern and relief, while others held suspicion and barely contained rage. Mayor Henry Douglas emerged from the town hall, his official demeanor doing little to hide his obvious discomfort with the situation. He was a man who prided himself on maintaining order and predictability in Millbrook Valley, and Sarah's return threatened to upset the delicate balance he had worked years to establish. The community had finally begun to heal from the trauma of the raid that took her, and now her presence was reopening old wounds. William Mitchell appeared in the doorway of his general store, having heard the commotion from inside, where he had been organizing inventory. When his eyes met his daughter's, the color drained from his face. He aged 10 years in that single moment, his hands gripping the doorframe so tightly his knuckles turned white. The man who had given up hope of ever seeing his child again was now faced with a reality he had stopped allowing himself to dream about. Sarah took a tentative step toward her father, but the crowd's agitation stopped her. Voices were rising, arguments breaking out between neighbors who had lived peacefully beside each other for years. The sight of Maria seemed to intensify the conflict, with some people pointing at the child and others moving protectively closer to Sarah. Thomas Carter had been loading supplies into his wagon when the disturbance began. As a rancher who lived on the outskirts of town, he made regular trips to the general store, but typically avoided getting involved in community politics. He was a quiet man who had lost his own wife to fever 3 years earlier and had since focused entirely on his cattle and the demanding work of frontier ranching. But something about the scene unfolding in the town square compelled him to stay and observe. Unlike many residents of Millbrook Valley, Thomas had spent significant time interacting with Apache traders and had learned enough of their language to conduct basic negotiations. He understood their customs and respected their connection to the land in ways that most townspeople considered dangerous or foolish. This perspective gave him a different view of Sarah's situation, one that recognized the complexity of her experience rather than simply judging it through the lens of fear. The argument in the crowd was escalating rapidly. Jonas Crawford, a local rancher whose brother had died in the raid that took Sarah, was demanding that the town take immediate action to protect itself from what he saw as a potential threat. His voice carried the pain of a decade-old loss and the fear that Sarah's return might signal renewed Apache interest in their community. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. On the other side, Martha Henderson, who had been Sarah's closest neighbor before the raid, was arguing passionately for compassion and understanding. She reminded everyone that Sarah was a victim who deserved their support rather than their suspicion. Her words carried the weight of genuine emotion, but they were being drowned out by louder, angrier voices. Sarah watched this debate about her future with a mixture of sadness and resignation. She had experienced this kind of division before, living in a world where Apache and white cultures viewed each other with suspicion and hostility. She had hoped that returning home might offer her and Maria a place where they could belong, but the reception was making it clear that acceptance would not come easily. Maria tugged on Sarah's worn dress, speaking quietly in Apache. She was asking why the people seemed angry and whether they were safe. Sarah knelt down and responded in the same language, reassuring her daughter while simultaneously causing several people in the crowd to step back nervously. The sight of Sarah speaking Apache fluently was proof to some that she had been irreversibly changed by her captivity. Dr. Webb pushed through the crowd and approached Sarah with the calm authority that came from years of treating patients regardless of their circumstances. He had delivered most of the children in Millbrook Valley and had seen every kind of human suffering and resilience. His medical training had taught him to look beyond surface appearances and focus on immediate needs. "You look exhausted," he said gently, his eyes moving between Sarah and Maria. "When did you last have a proper meal or a safe place to rest?" His practical concern cut through some of the tension, reminding everyone present that they were looking at a woman and child who had traveled hundreds of miles under difficult conditions. Sarah's response was cautious but grateful. "We have been walking for many days," she said, her voice carrying an accent that reflected her time away from English-speaking communities. "Maria is tired and hungry." She paused, looking around at the faces surrounding them. "I had hoped we might find welcome here, But I understand that my return creates difficulties for everyone. The honesty in her words seemed to catch some people off guard. This wasn't the defiant or broken woman they had expected to encounter. Sarah spoke with dignity and awareness of how her presence affected others, showing a maturity that came from years of navigating complex cultural situations. Thomas Carter found himself stepping forward, though he hadn't consciously decided to get involved. "There's a boarding house just opened last year," he said, addressing Dr. Webb, but speaking loudly enough for others to hear. "Mrs. Anderson runs it clean and serves decent meals. Might be the child could use some proper food and rest before any decisions get made about anything." His suggestion was practical and humane, offering an immediate solution that didn't require the community to resolve all their conflicts immediately. Several people nodded in agreement, recognizing the wisdom of ensuring basic care before addressing larger questions about Sarah's permanent situation. But Jonas Crawford wasn't satisfied with delay. "That child is proof of what happened to her out there," he said harshly, his voice carrying across the square. "How do we know she hasn't brought trouble back with her? How do we know the Apache aren't planning to use her as a way to get information about our defenses?" His words reflected fears that had haunted Millbrook Valley since the original raid. The community had invested significant resources in improving their security, and many residents remained convinced that another attack was inevitable. Sarah's return, especially with a child who was clearly of mixed heritage, seemed to validate their worst anxieties about ongoing threats. Martha Henderson responded with equal passion. "Sarah Mitchell is William's daughter, and she belongs here. Look at her. She's barely more than skin and bones. Does she look like someone who's been living comfortably? Does that child look like a threat to anyone? We should be ashamed of ourselves for even considering turning away our own people." The debate continued to rage as the afternoon heat intensified. Sarah remained standing in the center of the square, holding Maria's hand while dozens of people argued about their fate. She had endured captivity, learned to survive in a harsh environment, given birth to a child under conditions most people couldn't imagine, and walked hundreds of miles to return home. Now she was being forced to stand silently while others decided whether she deserved basic human compassion. William Mitchell finally found his voice and his courage. Moving slowly but deliberately, he walked toward his daughter while the crowd watched in tense silence. When he reached her, he stopped just an arm's length away, studying her face as if trying to reconcile his memories with the woman standing before him. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice breaking on her name. "I never stopped hoping you were alive. Somewhere. Every day for 10 years, I wondered if you might come home." Sarah's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the father who had aged so dramatically in her absence. "Papa," she whispered, using the childhood name she hadn't spoken in a decade. "I never stopped thinking about home, about you, about this place. I survived because I believed I might see you again someday." The emotional reunion between father and daughter shifted something in the crowd's mood. Watching William Mitchell embrace the child he thought he had lost forever reminded everyone present of the human cost of frontier violence. Whatever complications Sarah's return might create, she was still a daughter coming home to her father. But even as some hearts softened, others remained hardened by years of fear and prejudice. The sight of Maria, with her mixed heritage clearly visible, served as a constant reminder of the cultural divide that had shaped their community's relationship with the Apache. For some residents, the child represented everything they feared about the blurring of boundaries between their world and the indigenous communities they viewed as threats. Thomas Carter continued to observe the unfolding drama while loading the last of his supplies. His own experience with loss had taught him that grief and fear could make people react in ways they might later regret. He had seen enough of life to understand that situations like this rarely had simple solutions, but he also recognized that Sarah and Maria needed immediate practical support regardless of whatever long-term decisions the community might make. As the sun began to sink lower in the Colorado sky, Mayor Douglas finally stepped forward to address the crowd. The debate had gone on for hours without resolution, and the intensity of emotions was beginning to exhaust everyone involved. He raised his hands for attention, using his official authority to impose some structure on the chaotic situation. "People of Millbrook Valley," he began, his voice carrying the weight of his office. "We are faced with a situation that requires careful consideration and wisdom. Sarah Mitchell has returned to us after 10 years, and she has brought a child. These are facts we must accept. However, the questions about what this means for our community's safety and future are legitimate concerns that deserve serious discussion." He paused, looking around at the crowd before continuing. "I propose that we provide temporary accommodation for Sarah and the child while we take time to properly consider all aspects of the situation. Mrs. Anderson has agreed to provide rooms at the boarding house for the next week. During this time, we will hold community meetings to discuss how we move forward in a way that serves everyone's interests." The mayor's proposal offered a compromise that gave both sides time to process their emotions and develop more thoughtful positions. Sarah would receive immediate care and shelter, but the community wouldn't be forced to make permanent decisions. While tensions were running so high, Dr. Webb stepped forward to support the mayor's suggestion. "From a medical standpoint, both Sarah and the child need proper nutrition and rest before anything else can be addressed. I'll examine them both tomorrow to ensure they're in good health. Beyond that, any decision should wait until we've all had time to think clearly about this situation." As the crowd began to disperse, small groups formed to continue discussing the day's events. Some people remained convinced that Sarah's return posed a danger to their community, while others felt ashamed of their initial reactions and wanted to find ways to welcome her home. The division that had emerged in the town square would continue to shape conversations in homes and businesses throughout Millbrook Valley. Sarah gathered Maria into her arms as they prepared to follow Mrs. Anderson to the boarding house. The little girl was overwhelmed by everything she had witnessed, clinging to her mother and speaking softly in Apache. Sarah responded in the same language, offering comfort and reassurance while trying to process her own complex emotions about the day's events. Thomas Carter approached them as they prepared to leave the square. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, addressing Sarah directly, "I know today has been difficult for you and your daughter. If you need anything during your stay at the boarding house, anything at all, my ranch is just outside town. I'm usually in town twice a week for supplies, and I want you to know that not everyone here sees your return as a problem to be solved." His words offered the first genuine welcome Sarah had received since arriving in Millbrook Valley. She looked up at this tall, weathered man who had shown kindness when others offered only suspicion or pity. "Thank you," she said simply. "Your words mean more than you might realize." As they walked toward the boarding house, Sarah carried Maria while reflecting on everything that had changed and everything that remained the same. The mountains were still beautiful, her father still loved her, and the general store still stood on Main Street. But the community that had once felt like home was now divided by questions about her place in it. The first day of her return was ending, but Sarah understood that the real challenges were just beginning. She had survived 10 years of captivity and made an incredible journey to come home, but now she faced the possibly more difficult task of finding acceptance in a community torn between fear and compassion. The next few days would determine not just her future, but the kind of community Millbrook Valley would choose to become. Dawn broke over Millbrook Valley with an eerie stillness that seemed to hold its breath for what was to come. Sarah Mitchell had barely slept in the small room at Anderson's boarding house, her mind racing with memories of home that clashed violently with the reality of her reception. Maria had curled up beside her mother, exhaustion finally claiming the child after the overwhelming emotions of their arrival. Through the thin walls, Sarah could hear other guests stirring, their hushed conversations carrying fragments of her name and speculation about what her presence meant for the town. Mrs. Anderson had been kind but cautious the previous evening, providing a simple meal of bread, soup, and milk while avoiding direct eye contact with either Sarah or Maria. The older woman's discomfort was palpable, her movements stiff and her words carefully measured as if she feared saying something that might later be used against her. The boarding house had become an island of temporary safety in a sea of uncertainty, but Sarah understood that this sanctuary was as fragile as morning frost. The sound of voices outside drew Sarah to the window, where she could see small groups of townspeople gathering in the street below. Their animated discussions and pointed gestures in the direction of the boarding house made it clear that her situation remained the primary topic of conversation throughout Millbrook Valley. Some faces showed curiosity, others concern, and a few displayed the kind of hard determination that spoke of minds already made up about what should be done. Dr. Webb arrived shortly after breakfast, carrying his medical bag and wearing the professional demeanor that had served him well through decades of frontier medicine. He examined both Sarah and Maria with gentle thoroughness, his experienced hands checking for signs of illness or injury while his kind eyes assessed their overall condition. Sarah submitted to the examination with quiet dignity, understanding that the doctor's report would carry significant weight in whatever decisions the community ultimately made about their future. "You've both been through considerable hardship," Dr. Webb concluded after completing his assessment. "Sarah, you malnourished and showing signs of chronic stress, but fundamentally healthy. Maria appears to be a strong, well-cared-for child, despite the difficult circumstances of your journey." His words carried professional authority, but his tone held warmth that suggested genuine concern rather than clinical detachment. The doctor's examination provided Sarah with an opportunity to share some details of her experience without the pressure of a hostile audience. She spoke carefully about her life with the Apache, emphasizing her role as a healer and her efforts to bridge cultural differences whenever possible. Dr. Webb listened without judgment, his medical training having taught him to gather information objectively before drawing conclusions. "Your knowledge of traditional medicine could be valuable here," he observed after Sarah described some of the healing techniques she had learned. "We don't have enough medical resources on the frontier, and practical healing knowledge from any source is worth preserving." His comment suggested possibilities that Sarah hadn't dared to consider, ways that her unique experience might actually benefit the community rather than simply creating problems for it. Meanwhile, Thomas Carter was dealing with his own internal conflict about Sarah's situation. He had spent a restless night at his ranch, thinking about the fear and anger he had witnessed in town. His experience with Apache traders had taught him that cultural differences didn't necessarily indicate hostility, but he also understood the deep trauma that frontier communities carried from violent encounters. The challenge was finding a way to honor both perspectives while ensuring that justice and compassion prevailed. His morning routine of caring for livestock and checking fences provided time for reflection, but Thomas found his thoughts repeatedly returning to the dignity Sarah had shown despite the harsh reception she received. There was something about her quiet strength that reminded him of his late wife, who had faced her own challenges with similar grace and determination. The comparison stirred emotions he had worked hard to keep buried since his loss. Back in town, William Mitchell was struggling to reconcile his joy at his daughter's return with the complex realities her presence created. He had spent 10 years grieving for Sarah while trying to maintain his business and his sanity. Now she was back, but the community that had once rallied around his loss was divided about whether her return was a blessing or a curse. The general store that had been his refuge from grief was now becoming a gathering place for heated discussions about his daughter's fate. Customers who had once offered sympathy and support were now asking pointed questions about Sarah's loyalty, and the potential threat she might represent. Some suggested that William should send her away for the good of the community, while others argued that family bonds superseded any other considerations. The pressure was enormous, and William found himself caught between his love for his daughter and his obligations to the community that had sustained him through his darkest years. Jonas Crawford was organizing what he called a concerned citizens meeting, gathering support from residents who shared his view that Sarah's return posed an unacceptable risk to community safety. His arguments focused on the practical implications of harboring someone who had lived intimately with their enemies for a decade. He pointed out that Sarah's knowledge of the town's layout, defenses, and routines could be valuable intelligence for Apache raiders planning future attacks. The fact that she brought a child who was clearly of mixed heritage only reinforced Crawford's arguments in the minds of some residents. To them, Maria represented proof that Sarah had not just survived her captivity, but had actively participated in Apache society. The implications of this participation, in their view, called into question everything about Sarah's motivations and loyalties. Martha Henderson was equally active in organizing support for Sarah, but her efforts faced the challenge of addressing genuine fears while promoting compassion. She recognized that dismissing community concerns about security would only strengthen opposition to Sarah's acceptance. Instead, she focused on gathering stories from longtime residents who remembered Sarah's character before her capture, hoping to remind people of who she had been before circumstances beyond her control changed. Her life. The competing narratives about Sarah's return were creating divisions that extended far beyond the immediate question of her fate. Families found themselves arguing across dinner tables, with children listening to parents debate fundamental questions about justice, loyalty, and community values. The social fabric of Millbrook Valley was being stretched to its breaking point by questions that had no easy answers. Mayor Douglas found himself in an impossible position, trying to balance competing demands while maintaining some semblance of order and unity. His political survival depended on finding solutions that satisfied the majority of residents, but the community was so evenly divided that any decision would alienate a significant portion of his constituents. The temporary arrangement he had negotiated bought time, but it also allowed tensions to build rather than resolving them. Sarah spent her second day in Millbrook Valley, quietly observing the community dynamics while caring for Maria. The child was adapting to their new environment with the resilience that had enabled her to survive the difficult journey. But Sarah could see signs of stress in her daughter's behavior. Maria asked fewer questions and stayed closer to her mother, instinctively recognizing that they were in a precarious situation that required caution. The boarding house provided a vantage point for watching the town's daily rhythms, and Sarah noticed how conversations stopped when people saw her in the window. She recognized some faces from her childhood, but the years had changed everyone, and she struggled to reconcile her memories with the reality of people who had once been friends and neighbors. The distance between past and present seemed almost insurmountable. Thomas Carter's second visit to town was motivated by more than his usual need for supplies. He had decided that remaining neutral in the growing conflict was a form of cowardice that dishonored his own values. His wife had taught him that standing up for what was right sometimes required accepting personal costs, and he felt compelled to honor her memory by speaking up for Sarah and Maria. He found Dr. Webb at the clinic and asked for a private conversation about the medical assessment. The doctor's professional opinion carried significant weight in the community, and Thomas wanted to understand whether there were any health concerns that might influence the debate about Sarah's future. Dr. Webb's response was unequivocal in its support for Sarah's character and the child's well-being. "She's been through hell, but she's maintained her humanity," Dr. Webb told Thomas privately. "The way she cares for that child, the respect she shows for everyone despite how she's been treated, it all speaks to a strength of character that I find remarkable." If we judge her by her actions since returning, rather than our fears about what might happen, the choice should be clear. The doctor's assessment aligned with Thomas's own observations and strengthened his resolve to speak publicly in support of Sarah's acceptance by the community. He understood that his voice as a successful rancher and respected community member could influence others who remained undecided about the situation. The question was how to frame his support in terms that addressed legitimate concerns while promoting justice and compassion. That afternoon brought the first of the formal community meetings that Mayor Douglas had promised. The church was packed with residents eager to have their voices heard in the debate about Sarah's future. The atmosphere was tense from the moment people began filing into the pews, with supporters and opponents clustering in separate sections, as if preparing for battle rather than discussion. Jonas Crawford spoke first, presenting his case with the passion of someone convinced that the community's survival was at stake. He detailed his concerns about security, the precedent that accepting Sarah might set for future situations, and the practical difficulties of integrating someone who had lived outside civilized society for a decade. His arguments resonated with residents who had never fully recovered from the trauma of the original raid. Crawford's presentation was methodical and persuasive, focusing on concrete risks rather than abstract principles. He pointed out that Sarah's knowledge of Apache customs and language, while potentially valuable in some contexts, also made her a potential bridge for future raids or negotiations that might not serve the community's interests. His conclusion was stark but logical from his perspective. The town couldn't afford to gamble with everyone's safety for the sake of one person's redemption. Martha Henderson responded with equal passion but different arguments, focusing on moral obligations and community values. She reminded the audience of the Christian principles that supposedly guided their society, pointing out that rejecting someone who had suffered through no fault of her own violated everything they claimed to believe about compassion and forgiveness. Her words carried emotional weight, but they struggled against the practical fears that Crawford had articulated. The debate that followed revealed the depth of division within Millbrook Valley. Neighbors who had lived peacefully together for years found themselves on opposite sides of fundamental questions about justice, security, and community responsibility. Some speakers focused on Sarah's individual circumstances, while others addressed broader principles about how the community should respond to difficult situations. Thomas Carter waited until near the end of the meeting to request permission to speak. When Mayor Douglas recognized him, the church fell silent with the attention that his reputation commanded. Thomas was known as a man who chose his words carefully and spoke only when he had something meaningful to contribute to important discussions. "I've been listening to arguments about security and principles," Thomas began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church. "But I think we're missing something important in all this talk about what Sarah Mitchell might represent, or what precedent we might set. We're talking about a woman and her child who walked hundreds of miles to come home, and we're debating whether to offer them basic human decency." He paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected the full spectrum of community opinion. "I've spent time with Apache traders, and I've learned enough of their language to conduct business. That doesn't make me a threat to this community. It makes me someone who understands that survival on the frontier sometimes requires working with people who are different from us. Sarah Mitchell survived 10 years by learning to adapt, and now she's trying to adapt again to being home." Thomas's words introduced a perspective that neither Crawford nor Henderson had fully articulated. He was speaking from practical experience rather than theoretical principles, and his calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the emotional intensity that had characterized most of the evening's presentations. His reputation for sound judgment gave his words additional weight with community members who remained undecided. "The child changes nothing about Sarah's character," Thomas continued. "If anything, it demonstrates her capacity for love and protection under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. We're not being asked to approve of everything that happened to her, or everything she might have learned. We're being asked to recognize that she's still one of us, and that turning our backs on her would diminish all of us. The meeting ended without resolution, but Thomas's intervention had shifted the tone of the debate in subtle but important ways. His focus on practical humanity rather than abstract principles provided a framework for thinking about Sarah's situation that transcended the polarized positions that had dominated previous discussions. Some residents left the church with new perspectives on questions they thought they had already answered. Sarah had listened to the entire meeting from her room at the boarding house, the voices carrying clearly through the night air. She understood that her fate was being decided by people who knew almost nothing about her actual experiences or current circumstances. The disconnect between the person she had become and the fears or hopes that others projected onto her was profound and deeply painful. Maria had fallen asleep during the long meeting, exhausted by another day of uncertainty and stress. Sarah sat beside her daughter's bed, stroking the child's hair while contemplating the possibility that their journey home might end in rejection and exile. The courage that had sustained her through captivity and the dangerous trip to Millbrook Valley was being tested in ways she hadn't anticipated. The second day of her return was ending with more questions than answers, but Sarah sensed that something had shifted during the community meeting. Thomas Carter's words had introduced a new element into the debate, one that might create possibilities for acceptance that hadn't existed before. Whether those possibilities would be enough to overcome the fears and prejudices that divided the community remained to be seen. Outside, Millbrook Valley settled into another uneasy night, its residents wrestling with questions that challenged their deepest beliefs about justice, community, and redemption. The woman and child sleeping at Anderson's boarding house had become symbols in a larger struggle about what kind of community they wanted to be, and the choices made in the coming days would define their collective character for years to come. The third morning brought an unexpected development that would force Millbrook Valley to confront its divisions head-on. A writer had arrived at dawn carrying news that would transform the debate about Sarah Mitchell from a local controversy into a matter of immediate survival. Apache scouts had been spotted moving through the territory, and several outlying ranches reported signs of recent surveillance. The Frontier Telegraph had carried warnings of increased raiding activity throughout Colorado, and suddenly Sarah's presence in town took on an entirely different significance. Mayor Douglas called an emergency assembly for noon, understanding that the security situation would either vindicate those who saw Sarah as a threat or prove those who viewed her as a valuable resource. The timing couldn't have been more dramatic, forcing the community to make decisions about her future while facing the very dangers that had shaped their fears about her return. Sarah learned about the Apache activity from Mrs. Anderson, who delivered the news with barely concealed anxiety while serving a meager breakfast. The boarding house owner had grown increasingly nervous about harboring someone who might be connected to potential raiders, and her discomfort was evident in every interaction. The possibility that Sarah's former captors might be nearby transformed her from a controversial guest into what some would consider a dangerous liability. The news hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because she feared the Apache, but because she understood how their presence would be interpreted by the townspeople. Any hope of gradual acceptance was about to be destroyed by circumstances completely beyond her control. The timing seemed almost deliberately cruel, as if fate was determined to make her journey home as difficult as possible. Maria sensed her mother's distress and moved closer, speaking softly in Apache to ask what was wrong. Sarah's response in the same language was overheard by another guest at the boarding house, who immediately left to spread word about the foreign conversation. Within an hour, the story had grown into rumors that Sarah had been communicating with Apache scouts, despite the impossibility of such contact from her room at the boarding house. Thomas Carter was checking his cattle when he received word about the scout sightings from a neighboring rancher. His first thought wasn't about his own security, but about how this development would affect Sarah's situation in town. The timing was catastrophic for her chances of acceptance, and he realized that the emergency meeting would likely produce a decision driven by fear rather than justice. His sense of fairness compelled him to ride into town immediately, hoping to provide some voice of reason in what was certain to be a chaotic gathering. Dr. Webb was treating a patient with a broken arm when word reached him about the Apache Scouts. His medical training had taught him to remain calm under pressure, but he understood the implications for Sarah and Maria. The community was about to be asked to make a decision about their future, while gripped by the very fears that made rational discussion nearly impossible. He finished setting the broken bone with practiced efficiency, then prepared to attend the emergency meeting despite his usual reluctance to get involved in political disputes. Jonas Crawford saw the scout sightings as vindication of everything. He had argued about the dangers of harboring Sarah Mitchell. He spent the morning organizing his supporters and preparing arguments that connected her presence to the current threat, despite having no evidence of any actual communication between Sarah and the Apache. In his mind, the coincidence was too perfect to be accidental, and he was determined to use this opportunity to force the resolution he believed necessary for community safety. The emergency assembly filled the church beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and crowding the doorway to hear the proceedings. The atmosphere was electric with tension, fear, and anger as residents who had been debating abstract principles suddenly faced the possibility of immediate danger. Mayor Douglas struggled to maintain order as multiple conversations created a din that threatened to drown out any organized discussion. Crawford spoke first, his voice carrying the urgency of someone convinced that immediate action was required to prevent disaster. "The Apache Scouts aren't here by coincidence," he declared, his words cutting through the noise in the packed church. "They know Sarah Mitchell is here, and they're planning something. Every day we delay making a decision about her is another day we give them to plan an attack. We cannot afford to gamble with our families' lives based on sentiment about one person's feelings." His arguments resonated powerfully with parents who were imagining their children caught in a raid, with merchants who remembered the economic devastation that had followed the last attack, and with anyone who had lost family or friends to frontier violence. Crawford's presentation was designed to make Sarah's continued presence seem like an active threat to everyone in Millbrook Valley, rather than simply a controversial decision about community values. Martha Henderson attempted to respond with appeals for calm consideration, but her words struggled against the emotional intensity of fears about immediate danger. She pointed out that there was no evidence connecting Sarah to the scout sightings, that Apache raiding patterns had nothing to do with her presence in town, and that making decisions based on fear rather than facts would lead to injustice. Her arguments were logical but seemed inadequate against the visceral terror that gripped many community members. The debate that followed was unlike anything Millbrook Valley had experienced in years of democratic governance. Voices were raised in anger, accusations flew between neighbors, and the pretense of civilized discussion collapsed under the weight of primal fears about survival. Some residents demanded that Sarah be expelled immediately, while others argued that sending her away would be tantamount to murder given the danger from Apache raids. The divisions that had emerged over previous days crystallized into irreconcilable positions that seemed to offer no possibility of compromise. William Mitchell found himself in the impossible position of having to choose between his daughter's welfare and his community's demands. Several speakers directed their comments specifically at him, arguing that he had an obligation to convince Sarah to leave voluntarily, rather than forcing the community to take action against her. The pressure was enormous, and William's grief-lined face reflected the agony of a man being torn apart by competing loyalties. Thomas Carter waited until the shouting had reached its peak before standing to request permission to speak. His physical presence and reputation for level-headedness commanded enough attention to quiet the room temporarily, though the underlying tension remained palpable. When Mayor Douglas recognized him, Thomas approached the front of the church with the measured confidence of someone who had something important to say. "You're all talking like Sarah Mitchell is responsible for Apache Scout movements that have been happening throughout the territory for weeks," Thomas began, his voice steady despite the emotional chaos around him. "These raids aren't about her, and sending her away won't make them stop. If anything, her knowledge of Apache customs and language could help us prepare for whatever might be coming. We're about to make a decision based on fear that could cost us valuable intelligence and destroy an innocent woman in the process." His words introduced a perspective that hadn't been fully considered in the panic surrounding the scout sightings. Rather than viewing Sarah as a liability, Thomas was suggesting that her experience might actually be an asset in dealing with the current threat. The idea that she could help rather than hinder their defense preparations offered a third option that transcended the binary choice between acceptance and expulsion. Thomas continued his presentation by addressing the practical realities of frontier defense. "We all know that Apache raids follow patterns based on terrain, weather, and opportunity, not on whether particular individuals are present in targeted communities. The scouts are here because this is a prosperous town in a strategic location, not because Sarah Mitchell decided to come home. Blaming her for their presence is like blaming the rain for falling." His military experience during the Civil War lent credibility to his assessment of tactical situations, and several veterans in the audience nodded in recognition of his expertise. Thomas was offering a framework for understanding the current crisis that separated legitimate security concerns from unfounded fears about Sarah's loyalty or intentions. The revelation that changed everything came from an unexpected source. Old Pete Harrison, who had been quietly listening to the debate from the back of the church, suddenly stood and asked for permission to speak. Pete was known more for his taciturn nature than his eloquence, but he commanded respect as one of the community's founding members who had survived multiple Apache raids through careful preparation and good judgment. "I've been tracking those scouts for 3 days," Pete announced, his weathered voice carrying clearly through the now silent church. "Found their camp yesterday evening and watched them long enough to understand what they're doing here. They're not planning a raid on Millbrook Valley. They're hunting someone who escaped from them, someone they've been tracking for weeks, a white woman traveling with a child." The implications of Pete's revelation hit the assembly like a thunderbolt. Sarah wasn't connected to the Apache Scouts because she was cooperating with them. She was their target. The woman whom some had accused of potentially betraying the community was actually being hunted by the very people they feared. The entire framework of the debate shifted in an instant, transforming Sarah from a possible threat into someone who needed protection. Crawford's response was immediate and angry. "Even if that's true, it just means keeping her here will bring the Apache directly to our town. We'll be harboring someone they want, which makes us a target for whatever they're planning to do to get her back. The smart thing is still to send her away before they decide to attack the whole community to reach her." But Thomas Carter saw the situation differently, and his military experience provided insights that Crawford's fear couldn't match. If they're tracking her, sending her away alone would be sending her to certain death, he pointed out. But it also means they already know she's here, so the damage to our security situation is already done. The question now is whether we help defend one of our own or abandon her to save ourselves the trouble. The moral dimension of the choice had become starkly clear. Millbrook Valley could protect Sarah and accept the risks that came with her presence, or they could sacrifice her to Apache vengeance in hopes of avoiding conflict themselves. The decision would define the community's character in ways that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. Dr. Webb stood to offer his perspective on the medical and humanitarian aspects of the situation. "That woman and her child have been running for their lives for weeks, possibly months, he said with quiet authority. They're exhausted, malnourished, and traumatized. Sending them back into the wilderness while being hunted would be murder as surely as if we shot them ourselves. If we call ourselves a Christian community, we cannot make that choice. The debate that followed Pete's revelation was fundamentally different from the previous arguments about Sarah's loyalty or the abstract principles of community membership. Now they were discussing the concrete choice between protecting someone who had sought refuge with them or sacrificing her to preserve their own safety. The stakes were immediate and personal in ways that made abstract arguments seem inadequate. Mayor Douglas found himself facing a decision that would define his leadership and the community's values for years to come. The practical politician in him recognized that either choice would alienate significant portions of his constituency, but the moral weight of the situation demanded a response that transcended political calculations. He called for a brief recess to allow people to process Pete's information and consider its implications for their decision. During the recess, small groups formed throughout the church as residents struggled to reconcile their previous positions with the new information about Sarah's circumstances. Some of Crawford's supporters began to question whether they could support sending a woman and child to certain death, while some of Henderson's allies worried about the risks of protecting someone who was being actively hunted by Apache warriors. Sarah spent the recess period at the boarding house, unaware of Pete's revelation, but sensing that something significant was happening at the community meeting. The increased activity on the streets and the urgent conversations she could observe from her window suggested that new developments had changed the nature of the debate about her future. Maria stayed close to her mother, instinctively recognizing that they remained in a precarious situation despite being physically safe for the moment. When the meeting reconvened, Mayor Douglas addressed the assembly with the gravity that the situation demanded. We have learned information that changes the nature of our decision about Sarah Mitchell and her daughter. We are no longer debating whether to accept someone whose loyalties might be questionable. We are deciding whether to protect two people who are being hunted by the very enemies we fear, or whether to sacrifice them to avoid the risks that come with offering sanctuary. The mayor's framing of the choice eliminated the middle ground that some residents had hoped to find. There would be no gradual integration or trial period for Sarah's acceptance into the community. The immediate threat from Apache scouts meant that Millbrook Valley had to choose definitively between protection and abandonment, with full knowledge of the consequences either decision would bring. Thomas Carter made one final appeal to the community's conscience and practical intelligence. We have an opportunity to do what's right, while also gaining valuable intelligence about Apache movements and intentions, he argued. Sarah Mitchell has survived 10 years among the people who are now hunting her. Her insights into Apache culture also help the community avoid actions that might escalate the conflict unnecessarily. When some residents suggested displaying captured Apache weapons as a show of defiance, Sarah explained how such gestures would be interpreted as challenges that could turn a focused hunt into a broader tribal war. Her cultural understanding prevented several decisions that could have brought catastrophe upon the entire territory. The relationship between Sarah and her father deepened during these intense days of preparation. William Mitchell had spent 10 years grieving for his lost daughter, and now he was discovering that she had returned as a woman of remarkable strength and wisdom. Working together to fortify the general store created opportunities for conversations that helped bridge the gap between his memories and her reality. Sarah shared carefully chosen details about her life with the Apache, helping her father understand that her survival had required adaptation rather than submission. She described the moments when she had maintained her sense of identity despite pressure to abandon her white heritage completely, and she explained how thoughts of home had sustained her through the darkest periods of her captivity. These conversations helped William see her not as a victim who had been irreparably damaged, but as a survivor who had found ways to endure and grow stronger. The bond between Sarah and Thomas strengthened during a particularly dangerous mission: to gather intelligence about Apache movements in the surrounding hills. They spent 2 days hidden in rocky terrain, observing enemy scouts while avoiding detection themselves. The shared danger and mutual dependence created a level of trust and understanding that transcended the awkward circumstances of their first meeting. During quiet moments while maintaining their surveillance, they shared stories about their respective losses and the ways they had learned to cope with grief and trauma. Thomas spoke about his wife's death and the loneliness that had driven him to isolation on his ranch, while Sarah described the process of accepting that she might never see her home again while still maintaining hope for eventual freedom. Their conversations revealed common experiences of loss and resilience that created deep emotional connections. The mutual respect that developed between them was based on proven competence under pressure rather than romantic attraction, though both recognized the potential for deeper feelings if circumstances allowed. They worked together with the efficiency of experienced partners, each understanding the other's capabilities and limitations well enough to function as a single unit when facing danger. Sarah's growing integration into the community was tested. When a dispute arose about whether to evacuate the children to safer locations before the expected Apache attack, some parents argued that sending their children away was the only responsible choice, while others contended that separating families would weaken everyone's resolve to defend the town. The debate threatened to recreate the divisions that had initially greeted Sarah's return. Her intervention in this debate demonstrated the leadership qualities that had emerged during her years of adapting to impossible circumstances. Sarah argued that the decision should be based on realistic assessments of each family situation rather than blanket policies that ignored individual needs and capabilities. Her balanced approach helped the community reach compromises that respected both parental fears and practical defense requirements. The respect she had earned through her contributions to defense preparations gave her words weight in community discussions that extended beyond military matters. People began seeking her opinions on resource allocation, communication strategies, and morale issues that affected everyone's ability to endure the coming siege. Her transformation from controversial refugee to trusted advisor happened gradually, but decisively during these crucial days of preparation. The arrival of additional Apache scouts in the surrounding territory confirmed that the Shadow Wolves were preparing for a coordinated assault designed to capture Sarah and punish the community that had dared to protect her. The increased enemy activity forced accelerated completion of defense preparations while creating psychological pressure that tested everyone's resolve to honor their commitment to Sarah's protection. Thomas found himself serving not just as military coordinator, but as the emotional anchor that kept the community focused on their shared purpose rather than individual fears. His relationship with Sarah had become central to this role, as his confidence in her value to their survival helped convince others that protecting her remained their best hope for emerging from the crisis intact. The night before the expected attack, Sarah spent hours with Maria, telling her daughter stories about the grandfather she was finally getting to know and the community that had chosen to risk everything for their safety. The child's questions about why people had been angry with them initially led to conversations about fear, prejudice, and the courage required to do what was right, even when it was difficult. Sarah's own courage was tested when she realized that the Apache assault would likely focus on capturing her alive rather than simply destroying the town. The knowledge that she was the primary target created opportunities for tactical advantages, but also placed enormous psychological pressure on her to consider whether surrendering herself might save the community from destruction. The choice between self-sacrifice and continued resistance would define not just her character but her relationship with people who had become her new family. Thomas sensed her internal struggle and approached her for a conversation that would prove crucial to both their futures. His words carried the weight of someone who had learned hard lessons about duty, sacrifice, and the importance of fighting for principles, even when the cost seemed overwhelming. The discussion between them revealed the depth of their mutual respect and their shared commitment to protecting something larger than their individual survival. As dawn approached and the final preparations were completed, Millbrook Valley stood, ready to face an enemy that threatened everything they had built together during the crisis. The woman whose return had nearly torn the community apart had become the catalyst for unity and courage that none of them had known they possessed. The bonds forged during their preparation would soon be tested by fire, but they had already proven stronger than the fears and prejudices that had initially divided them. The transformation of Sarah Mitchell from controversial refugee to integral community member was complete, but the greater transformation of Millbrook Valley into a place where people would risk everything for principles of justice and protection was still being written. The coming battle would determine whether their newfound unity could survive the ultimate test of their commitment to each other and the values they claimed to share. The attack came at first light, silent shadows moving through the morning mist, like death itself, but Millbrook Valley was ready. Sarah's intelligence had prepared them for the Shadow Wolves' preferred tactics, and the community's coordinated response met the Apache warriors with a resistance they hadn't expected from settlers. The battle lasted 3 hours, fought in the streets and buildings of a town that had transformed itself into a fortress. Sarah positioned herself at the center of communications, translating intercepted Apache signals while coordinating defensive movements. Her voice remained steady as bullets shattered windows around her, calling out warnings and tactical adjustments that kept the defenders one step ahead of their attackers. Thomas led the main defensive force with the precision of a seasoned commander, but his eyes constantly tracked Sarah's position. When Running Bear himself appeared at the edge of the general store, clearly intent on claiming his escaped captive, Thomas didn't hesitate. The confrontation between the Apache war leader and the rancher who had chosen to protect Sarah became the turning point of the entire battle. The fight ended not with victory or defeat, but with something more profound. Running Bear, wounded but alive, found himself facing Sarah directly for the first time since her escape. The words they exchanged in Apache carried weight that transcended the violence surrounding them. Sarah spoke of choosing her own path rather than accepting the one others had forced upon her, while Running Bear acknowledged the courage of her decision even as he disagreed with it. When the Apache warriors withdrew, they left behind more than just the wounded and the dead. They carried with them the understanding that Sarah Mitchell had found her place among people willing to fight for her freedom. The Shadow Wolves would not return, not because they had been defeated, but because their quarry had proven herself worthy of the protection she had found. The aftermath revealed the true cost and value of the community's choice. 3 defenders had died protecting someone they barely knew, while several others bore wounds that would mark them for life. But Millbrook Valley had discovered something about itself that peaceful times could never have revealed. They had learned they were capable of courage that transcended self-interest, of unity that could overcome any division. Sarah stood with Thomas in the town square as the sun reached its zenith, looking at the buildings that bore scars from the morning's battle. The woman who had walked into town as a stranger was now undeniably part of something larger than herself. The man beside her had proven himself willing to risk everything for principles that defined his character more clearly than any words ever could. Maria ran to her mother's arms, chattering excitedly about the brave people who had fought to keep them safe. The child's innocent joy in being protected by her new community highlighted the simple truth that had emerged from all the complexity and conflict. Home wasn't a place, but a group of people who chose to care for each other despite the costs. William Mitchell embraced his daughter with tears streaming down his weathered face, finally understanding that she had returned not as the girl he had lost, but as the woman she had chosen to become. The general store around them bore bullet holes and broken glass, but it also held the promise of rebuilding something stronger than what had existed before. Dr. Webb treated the wounded with help from women who had learned medical skills during the crisis, while Martha Henderson organized food for defenders who had earned their place at the community table through shared sacrifice. The divisions that had once seemed insurmountable were healing as people worked together to repair the damage and care for each other. Thomas approached Sarah as the immediate chaos subsided, his expression carrying a question that went beyond tactical concerns or community politics. The respect that had grown between them during shared dangers had evolved into something deeper, something that offered possibilities neither had dared to consider while focused on mere survival. Sarah looked into his eyes and saw a future that hadn't existed when she first walked into Millbrook Valley. The community that had debated her worthiness had proven itself worthy of her loyalty through actions that spoke louder than any words. The man who had defended her right to belong had shown her what belonging could actually mean. Their conversation was interrupted by Mayor Douglas, who approached with the formal bearing of someone about to make an official pronouncement. The emergency had revealed leadership qualities in unexpected people while exposing the limitations of traditional authority structures. His words carried the weight of community consensus rather than individual decision-making. "Sarah Mitchell," he announced loud enough for everyone to hear, "Millbrook Valley owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid. Your courage saved lives today, and your knowledge made our defense possible. We would be honored if you would consider making your home here permanently, as a full member of our community with all the rights and responsibilities that entails." The offer was more than legal recognition. It was an acknowledgement that she had earned her place through contribution rather than charity. Sarah's response carried the dignity of someone who understood the value of what was being offered and the obligations that came with accepting it. "I walked hundreds of miles to come home," she said simply, her voice carrying clearly through the square. "I found something better than the place I remembered. I found people who understand that home is something you build together, something you defend together, something you choose together. If you'll have us, Maria and I would be proud to call Millbrook Valley our home." The cheers that erupted from the gathered crowd reflected genuine joy rather than mere relief. The woman who had once divided them had become the catalyst for discovering their best qualities. The child who had been seen as evidence of cultural contamination was now embraced as proof of their community's capacity for acceptance and love. Thomas stepped forward as the celebration continued around them, his voice quiet but clear as he addressed Sarah directly. "The ranch gets lonely, and it's more work than one person should handle alone. If you're looking for a place to build something permanent, I'd be honored to have partners who understand what it means to fight for what matters." His proposal carried implications that extended beyond practical arrangements or romantic attraction. He was offering partnership in its fullest sense, the kind of mutual commitment that emerged from proven trust under the most difficult circumstances. Sarah's smile in response spoke of a future neither had imagined possible when they first met. In crisis, as the sun set over Millbrook Valley on the day that would be remembered as the moment the community discovered its true character, Sarah Mitchell stood surrounded by people who had become family through choice rather than blood. The journey that had begun with rejection and suspicion had ended with acceptance and belonging that transcended anything she had dared to hope for. Maria played with other children in the square, her laughter mixing with the sounds of repair work and planning for a future that would be built on the foundation of courage they had discovered together. The little girl who had been born between worlds had found a place where multiple worlds could coexist and strengthen each other. The story of Sarah Mitchell's return to Millbrook Valley became the story the community told about itself, a reminder that people could choose to be better than their fears, stronger than their prejudices, and more courageous than their circumstances seemed to allow. The woman who had walked into town as a stranger had given them the gift of discovering who they really were when tested by crisis. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.